Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our second Social Imagination speaker series. We're I think we might get started acknowledging that some people are going to be trickling in. We recognize that this is in Australia. It's a bit later in the day and everybody is wrapping up work and family and pickup, and we appreciate you joining us. And if you're able to join us in real time and joining us on the recording, then thank you so much for watching this after the fact. We'll share a link to the chat so you can see all the juicy questions and discussion as well. So before we get started, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're calling in from. For myself, that's unceded Wurundjeri country here in Naarm in Melbourne, Australia. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend this respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. I would ask you if you'd like to put in the chat where you're calling in from and taking a moment in whatever way feels right for you to kind of think about paying respect and acknowledging the country that we're on, especially as we talk about things like social imagination. It feels so important to really actually take a moment to ground ourselves and to recognize that, at least on this continent where I'm calling in from, we have about 65,000 years of continuous living culture, of dreaming and learning and making and resisting into today. And so, really, if you could think about what does it mean for you to be calling in from the country that you're on? And we recognize that there's people joining from all around the world. So thank you so much for being with us today. Um, we just want to recognize all the lives and the stories and the wisdoms that have always been and that always will be. So, as you will have read in the event invitations, we're hosting this series because we really believe that as we grapple with the past events and the ongoing harms, and we're trying to work towards a more just and equitable future, we need to find ways that move beyond piecemeal reform and that create space to reimagine together how things could be a little bit radically different. The systems that we are part of have been constructed by somebody's imagination, and that's a very specific imagination. It's driven by particular logics and it reinforces particular sorts of programs and policies and ways of doing things. And it serves a particular group of people, but at the ongoing expense of other people's ability to thrive and create futures for themselves and for their kin. And from these particular imaginings, we recognize that we have inherited systems, the systems with unspoken assumptions and values that encourage us to go and act in certain ways and that reward and reproduce certain behaviors. And so for so many people on this call, you might resonate where even when you're trying to fix and to fund and to design our way towards improvements, we find that we're kind of stuck and entrenched in these systems that we kind of keep reproducing. And that's part of why we are here today and so excited about this idea of social imagination. So together with Third Story, the Center for Public Impact is hosting this speaker series because we've seen that social imagination is becoming a bit of a coalescing term, and it bridges multiple practices and approaches and disciplines. But at its core, I feel and we feel like it's liberatory. It requires that we get curious about the imaginations that have created the systems that we're part of. And it asks us to intentionally make spaces where other ways of imagining can thrive. Through this entire series, we're looking at what social imagination is, which was in session 1 with Ruth and Hannah. We're looking at how to enable it and fund it and scale it, which is why we're joined by our incredible speakers today, who we'll hear from in just a moment. And in our final session, we're going to be exploring the question of whose social imaginations are we living in? But wait, there's more. In a 3-part social imagination speaker series, there is a 4th. So we have really been enjoying the generative and lively chats that we've had. And despite this just being a webinar, we've seen so much peer-to-peer learning and opportunity to really continue this conversation. So we're going to be hosting a 4th after party. And this is going to be an open Zoom room, and it's going to be a space for your hot takes, to share that project that you've been working on, to say, okay, but what about this thing? And to really get into it. So we'll have an open space, nominate some topics, and you'll be able to discuss and debate and present and show and we'll get to have that sort of open space together. So what that means is we would love if we could keep some of the energy and the curiosity from the first session and keep the comments and questions flowing, and also respect the time and the energy that Constance and Shamal and Kai are sharing with us today as they present about their work, because they're really going into depth and trusting us to be in a constructive dialogue and get curious about what they're presenting. So if we could keep the questions for now related to the speaker's work and helping draw out more insights and curiosity about what is being presented. And then we'll have a fourth open session at the end of the speaker series that will be for everybody to continue sharing and asking questions and being in conversation. So very, very briefly, I will just introduce myself and the Center for Public Impact, and then I'll hand it over to Perry to speak a little bit more about the work of Third Story and the session today. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, I'm Allie Edwards. I'm a senior program manager at the Center for Public Impact, and we're a global not-for-profit that works in kind of regionally specific ways, trying to reimagine government so that it works better for everyone. And at ANZ, this means that we work with people, especially working in government, to kind of think systemically, to embrace working in complexity, and really importantly, to build meaningful relationships and think about how you're kind of continually learning and adapting alongside the people that they serve. We've very excitingly gotten to work on a couple social imagination projects that you can read about online. And we won't talk about right now in this session because we're about to hear from our speakers. So I might hand it over to Perry to speak a little bit more about the work of Third Story and to frame our session up. Thanks, Perry.
Thanks so much, Ali, for that beautiful introduction, and welcome everyone. It's so great to see you all again, and to welcome new people who weren't able to attend the first session. So my name's Perry Ballantyne. I'm a director at an organisation called Third Story. Some of you might have encountered our work under our previous name. We've just recently had a rebrand. We used to be known as Innovation Unit Australia New Zealand. We're a partner for social innovation and change, and we've been operating here for about 10 years, in Melbourne for 2. And we work locally and internationally to imagine new possibilities and build conditions for social impact at scale. And our work typically brings together communities, government, services, and other partners, usually to grow ideas for how we'll tackle challenges together and to make that stuff happen. So we've been talking about this social imagination series with CPI for almost a year, actually. Sort of we came together because we had a shared interest in the disciplines and practices that actually help us to imagine and move towards better futures. So we know how hard it can be to create that space for really understanding a challenge from diverse perspectives, for really exploring possibilities with the depth and the detail that we need to in order to make something new happen. And so we're interested in what social imagination can show us about how to shape things differently together. We're very excited about this particular session. It's got a great set of speakers who we'll introduce shortly. Just to say something a little about what's brought this group together in our own imagination is that everybody, all these speakers have significant and unique experience developing new models and initiatives and approaches that support imagination at scale. So there are a couple of themes that I think unite the work of these speakers and characterize the work. One of them is bringing together diverse partners to collaborate in new ways across cities, across countries, across fields of practice, internationally. These speakers all create spaces and conditions for social imagination, new spaces where we can imagine, develop, and take forward different possibilities. And I think all of our speakers can speak to the challenge of connecting communities and creatives with sources of funding and government partnerships and other kinds of partnerships in order to enable significant long-term change. And this for us is often the hardest part of social imagination work. Like how do we build those partnerships that enable us to take ideas into action that actually lead to real change? Very excited about this panel. This panel includes Constance Agyeman, who is the founder of G-STEP, a challenge prize to foster young people's innovation and problem solving in Ghana. She's worked on so many different challenge-led programs in different global contexts as director for Nesta's Challenge Works, which is where I first met her. Can't wait to hear more from Constance. We're also joined by Kaj Löfgren, who's the CEO of Regen Melbourne, who many of you will know this initiative. It's an engine for collaboration in service of Melbourne's future, bringing together multiple organisations, over 200, in initiatives that tackle wildly ambitious goals. And we're joined by Shamal Dass, who holds a number of executive and board roles in the social impact space. Amongst many, many other things, he's chair of ARACI and involved in the Investment Dialogue for Children, which is a 10-year collaboration between government and philanthropy to improve health and wellbeing in children, young people and families. And I also particularly know Shamal's work through the Constellation Project, which is a really interesting initiative bringing partners together with people with lived expertise to find new solutions to homelessness and housing insecurity. So really interesting collection of lived of expertise here. Really excited by the practice and what will be shared this evening. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ali, so you can introduce Constance properly.
Thank you so much, Perry. And just before I introduce Constance, thank you to all of you in the chat who are sharing where you're calling in from. We welcome your questions and comments throughout the series and throughout the session and the series. And what we're intending is we're going to hear briefly from each of the speakers, and then we'll have a bit of an open Q&A. So as you're thinking about like what's the good juicy question to really help kind of share more about the practice or get to the heart of like how do we make this happen? If I could ask you, try to contain your overall enthusiasm for the open Q&A at the end. And as we have questions for our individual speakers as they're presenting, that would be really helpful for us to help moderate and make sure that we're asking really pertinent questions of the speakers at the right time. So thank you for your curiosity and listening, because it takes a lot to share about your practice. So we really want to respect and be generous with our speakers. So our first speaker is Constance. And Constance is the co-founder of the Partnership Bureau in Ghana. And it boasts a rich background in development and innovation, notably serving as the former director of international development at Nesta's Challenge Works, as Perry mentioned. With a prolific socially fostered career spanning almost 30 years, she spearheaded impactful projects across Africa, Asia, and Europe, leveraging her expertise across many sectors. And Partnership Bureau is forging practical tools and resources that support the use of principled power, partnership equity, and access to opportunities that generate meaningful impact through collaboration, whether localized or international endeavors. Constance believes in the power of creating better futures by collectively rethinking and reimagining social structures. And I think we're about to hear a little bit about what that looks like in action. So Constance, thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ali. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. Let me try and share my screen now. I realized I couldn't do full presentation mode before I'd actually got onto the screen. So let's see if I can do that now. I hope you are all seeing the screen okay. Is that all right? Fantastic. Um, Thank you so much for having me. I am gonna take a few moments to talk about a particular funding mechanism that I've used for the past decade or so in my career, challenge prizes, also known as challenge-driven innovation, and think a little bit about how it can enable and be used as a funding mechanism to support social imagination. And as the term is kind of evolving and becoming more utilized, it's not something that I was using throughout my challenge prize career as it was. That's still ongoing. I'm still working with challenge prizes and challenge driven innovation. But I really started to look at what is it that we were trying to achieve through the way in which we were developing and delivering our challenge prizes and designing those and co-designing those. And there is a real resonance with social imagination. So let's just start, I guess, with the basic of what is a challenge prize. And it's a funding mechanism. It's often a grant mechanism. It can be an investment mechanism. It can be a blend of lots of different types of funding, depending on the type of challenge that is being driven here. It's a competitive process usually that really tries to bring in a whole range of innovators to solve a particular problem. So a really important factor around a challenge prize is that it is centered around a problem. We're really trying to understand a problem and galvanize support solutions, awareness and ecosystem around that. And there's generally a reward mechanism, which can be quite contentious if it's a big financial reward. But I think that's not the important part about what this funding mechanism of a challenge prize can do. Um, it's a journey. I think one of the things that we need to recognize is it's a journey. I'm going to talk about how it opens up or can open up a whole new world of opportunity and bringing in different communities to participate and to come up with solutions. Um, we really hope the way in which it is designed can catalyze collective creativity and a collective voice and a shared ecosystem around this. And hopefully that creates a range of conditions for imagination. So I think it's something that we can explore that really leans into opening up a space for social imagination. There's two examples I'm going to talk about specifically. One of them is the Ghana Science and Tech Explorer Prize. And this is a challenge prize for junior high school students in Ghana. And it's really trying to achieve two things. It's really trying to enhance the STEM skills, soft skills, communication, teamwork skills among young people. It's really trying to lean into the curriculum and provide a practical opportunity for young people to engage with their learning. And it's also trying to apply that to a real world context. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The Data-Driven Farming Prize is the other challenge prize that I'll use as an example. And that was a challenge prize in 2017 that was really aimed at supporting Nepali smallholder farmers to build the capacity to be more productive through data powered tools and products. So really we were framing an issue around how do you use data? So that was the specificity. How can you actually draw on data and use data? But the real outcome was how do you support farmers, smallholder farmers to be more productive? So I'm going to actually start with the data-driven farming prize and look at the two aspects of areas that I spoke about in terms of what a challenge prize can do. So I mentioned, first of all, it's a journey. It's an opportunity to develop and learn and iterate and grow as you go along. The journey starts long before the challenge prize starts. There's in a challenge prize guide we have, there's an iceberg kind of reference. And what you see is a tip of the iceberg, but there is so much more going on under that iceberg. And really, that's what a challenge prize represents. Before you even get to the design of a challenge, we really need to lean into some of those characteristics of social imagination by understanding the problem that we want to tackle. And in this case, the productivity issues and the challenges that the smallholder farmers were experiencing in Nepal. And then connecting that with a very specific problem. We could have been very open and we could have come up with a challenge that felt less targeted, less focused. But actually, as we had conversations before the design with smallholder farmers, with extension services in Nepal, with government departments, with other service providers in the ecosystem, it became apparent that there was a lot of information that was being gathered and a lot of data that was out there in different sources in different places. And so that felt like a really good opportunity to say, how can we utilize this challenge prize to harness that and to focus innovators on the use of that to really support smallholder farmers? But then we had to recognize some of the challenges along with that in terms of access to data, use of utility of technology, and then find other ways that that information can be presented. So the challenge prize as a reward for an innovation journey is about how do you galvanize the interest after you had a range of sessions with community and figured out what the focus is. And then how do you actually support the innovators that might come forward to do this? So there's usually a stage gated process in the challenge prizes that we have. And so there's the ideation stage where you're really drawing in the conversation, really bringing in a range of conversation from the ecosystem and drawing that along before getting into a competitive phase where there is entry forms and applications. And really, you have to think about how you structure that journey. So often we are building in checkpoints of capacity building. When we want to encourage a range of innovators, but that might not be used to these processes, we want to ensure that they are able to participate fully. And that means a range of capacity support, capacity building support that might be needed to around doing the entry forms, around actually building and developing a prototype, around engaging with an ecosystem in a way that they haven't before. And so being able to construct all of those elements as part of the innovation journey is really an important factor. And that then takes me to opening up to who participates. The design of a challenge, there's every single challenge I've done, over 30 of them, they are all very, very different. There might be some similarities in some of the structures, but actually what we're presenting in terms of the different staging, the different levels of interaction, the way in which we'll engage with community and the ecosystem is all very structured to the context that it's in, the challenge that we're trying to address, and the participants around that, as well as the communities that form that ecosystem. So for us with Data Driven Farming Prize, we were quite struck by a lot of the data-driven prizes at that time being global prizes, but then solutions coming from elsewhere around the globe that didn't seem to understand the context or the relevance within the community that it was supposed to be ending up serving. And so we really wanted to drive more localized, lived experience, innovation and innovators into the space for this prize. So we made it one of the conditions of that, that you could be, it could be a global challenge, but there had to be either led or equally involved with local innovators. And so we wanted to make sure that the lived experience was respected, the proximal experience was respected, and really value the context that it was being delivered in and that it was serving and that it was involving, and also respect time and commitment of the ecosystem that's actually in that lived space. So a challenge prize in a social imagination context is opening up and can provide a space for those that have much more of a lived experience to be engaged, involved, shaping, driving, and really, I guess, designing and framing what this could look like for them, because ultimately it's them that will be utilizing, benefiting, not benefiting from if it's not designed correctly. So we want to ensure that that community experience is there, and that's a community of not only lived experience from a smallholder farmer perspective in this case, but also from the government departments that enable the policy and processes, the service providers and extension services that are there as well. So that's two aspects of that. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the second example, of G-Step and pick up on another couple of points here, because I'm always going over time. So G-Step focused around young people and really trying to build agency in young people in the way in which they learn. But that requires a whole set of infrastructure. And so we're mainly operating in junior high schools here. We have faculty, the teachers, the whole infrastructure of the school itself, as well as the Ghana Education Service, the Ministry of Education, other non-profits and service providers that are operating in those schools. And so we really wanted to make sure that all of those players were involved in the conversation of how this was shaped. And we were fortunate enough to have a funder that, when initially supporting this, gave us the space to have a year of interactions with the community before actually setting off with the challenge prize. And that's quite challenging. Often people are funding and say, right, you can maybe have a couple of months to get yourself organized, but we want to see the results from that. But they understood the importance of really being able to have interactions, look at what the scope of this could be, feel the ambition of it, but work directly with the young people and the teachers to be able to do that. So I want to just talk about challenge prizes being an opportunity to catalyze collective creativity. When we brought all of those players into the space and we explored some of the challenges that were being experienced, that real practical sense of education, an opportunity for young people to have hands-on experience was lacking. We still are coming out of a rote teaching system in Ghana where you're just told theoretically what there is to do. You learn it by heart and you chew and paw, as they say. You kind of chew it and you spit it out the other end, and that's it. You've learned. And so obviously we recognize the importance of practical education in that, and the ability for young people to learn so much more with hands-on experience. And so young people work in teams, supported by a teacher, supported by a mentor and a coach, from a technical perspective, from a business perspective. And what they are doing is applying and thinking about the problems that they're experiencing in the community and how the STEM skills that they're learning can address those problems. And so there's a real resonance with, we're not just learning this has some context in reality. And I think that connection with social imagination and understanding the reality of how this plays out in people's lives kind of resonates here. It creates a condition for imagination, because you're then saying, you identify the problem, you tell us what is it that's really bothering you within the community, but then the skills that you have are about you determining how that can be solved. So that's another thing about challenge prizes and the beauty of challenge prizes. They are agnostic about the solution. We want to be clear about the problem, but we want to be agnostic about the solution, because as soon as we start to predetermine what the solution can be, it closes down the opportunity for something radically different, for nuance, for all sorts of things. And then you might as well go down a procurement route rather than an open innovation route. If you know what you want and you think that's the solution, and I think we heard from Ruth and Hannah that when the Essex had been doing a lot of work in Canvey Island that was based on infrastructure and based on the same thing over 20 years. You have to think radically differently about how that is. And we wanted to provide that for our young people, for them to build that agency really early on, to know that they are not necessarily blocked in to a certain way of thinking, but have a space and scope to imagine. So I'll come to the end of this. I think one thing that I always find really interesting about a challenge fund, it's more than a fund. It's about connecting to real world problems. It's about creating the space and the scope to really imagine and to ideate and to then see that through in a practical sense. There's usually a whole range of support mechanisms that are involved in that. The mentoring, the coaching, providing tools and resources. Like these young people have industry visits to help ground them. They are having to do entrepreneurial types of aspects to see how you can build and scale these opportunities for business plans. They are presenting and doing pitching and exhibition work. So the skills that they develop are much more than the sum of saying, just enter a competition and get a prize at the end. That's not what it's about. And those prizes and challenge prizes can often be sums of money. But for this, it's actually the labs, the lab equipment, the tools, the mentoring and coaching that is needed, that becomes the prize, so that there is something more sustainable and a legacy that is left in the schools that are involved and that get engaged, so that not only the young people that participate now, but those that come forward, that they inspire by their participation, can also have an opportunity to do that. And that's part of our scale model. It's part of saying we have to keep amplifying what happens in these spaces, in these schools, and give an opportunity for that to grow. So I will come to an end because I know I'm running out of time. This, I've just bombarded a lot of pictures here, because if I went through them one by one, we would have been here even longer, and that you don't need that. So we have a youth voice. This is a youth program, and so a youth steering group was really important to us. But there's a lot of work that's needed to really help those young people understand that role and really have agency in that role. We want young people to be able to speak for themselves in these contexts. And so giving them a voice and giving them the platform to be able to speak. We have to work with the ministries of education, the Ghana Education Service, if we want this to become an embedded set of practice within that ecosystem. But we also want a really professional perspective. So the young people have an exhibition, which is an industry standard exhibition. They brand their stands, they come and pitch, and all of those types of things. And the celebration of that, and saying that you've been through a journey, this is just the beginning of the journey, and it's a platform for transformation and a platform for continued development, is really, really important to us. So that's what all of this says. Challenge Prize is more than just a fund. There are lots of important factors that really facilitate social imagination. So not just a fund, it's how we embed it. The size of the fund should be an incentive, but it should be contextually relevant. It has to be relevant, like we give lab equipment rather than funds. Don't get tied to a solution before the problem is really understood and the community and the ecosystem have been involved in that. And give space to those that are living out and going to continue living out the solution, the significant part of the platform, the conversation, the space, and be open to uncertainty. And finally, why I'm interested in this kind of work, I'm just deeply curious about the world and the way it works and social constructs. I don't want to accept the standard or norm as fixed. There is so much of what we have that is broken and that we've put in place and that we feel really restricted to. So I'm really interested in finding out ways in which we can draw that out. And I think social imagination gives us permission, gives us an opportunity to stretch ourselves, to question, to build futures that feel more expansive. And I'm all about joy. So I want to feel the joy in life. I want us to be able to feel the humility and the humanity of it all. So I don't get it all. That was my last point. I don't get it all, but I'm really into it. So that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Constance, thank you so much. It is just a complete joy to listen to you talk about the work that you do, and it is such powerful, distinctive work. So I'm going to invite people to put some questions for Constance in the chat. I want to just reflect on how unusual this work is in many ways. It probably seems normal to you to kind of offer up the opportunity for ideas to come in from unusual places, and the idea that you might be agnostic about the method, but agnostic about the outcomes Sorry, can you describe that one for me again? Agnostic about
Uh,
the solution.
Agnostic about the solutions. Yeah, they could come from anywhere. They could be anything as long as they're leaning towards the problem.
Exactly. And this is such an unusual way to procure or commission things. So what I'd love to start with is what you can tell us about how your partners come together. What drives them? Why do they decide to do this instead of procuring a single solution or doing something else?
I think a lot of our partners are recognizing that the way in which they have been doing things isn't necessarily yielding great results. But I also think the way in which we have the conversation is that this is an added value tool. It's a versatile tool to be used as part of the toolbox. And so we're always saying that we have to flex and stretch around the different methods and the different tools that we use to achieve particular results. And I think that is of interest to them. We are not saying replace everything that you've done before. We're just saying recognize that there are other ways in which you might be able to achieve different results and have different conversations and build an ecosystem and a network differently. And that's what usually brings them into the conversation, and the fact that you can then explore and enhance and focus, and really bring in those unusual suspects that you were talking about, Harry. They a lot of organizations have dealt with the same implementer service providers for a very long time. They get into a tranche of doing that because they're the trusted service providers, but it then I think makes the system a bit lax, and we just go into a kind of sleepwalking mode of delivering things, or seeing how we achieve outcomes. So I think that's what is of interest to the partners that come around the table, and many of them are just excited about trying something different and seeing how that might enhance or help their work.
Thanks, Constance. And the framing of folks as innovators is also very powerful too. The way that, innovators, we have some kind of ideas in our head about who gets to be one. But I love that your work describes us all potentially as having innovative potential and being able to offer solutions up if we're given permission and asked. So I love that about the work that you do. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the other forms of support that the prizes that you run offer beyond money. You've mentioned a few things, but it strikes me that that can be incredibly important to the development of a strong solution and, embedding that in a
Sure.
community. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that aspect of the work.
Sure. So I guess starting at the beginning with even application processes, I mean, ultimately the challenge prize methodology has come from a kind of grant making process, and it's a very old process. This is 300 years, in the making of challenge prizes in all their various forms and guises. But that application process in many grants type systems can be really off-putting and scary. An innovator with lived experience hasn't done that kind of application process before. So starting there and really thinking about, well, what type of application process do you have? Is it one of these long, tedious forms that is asking lots and lots of really horrible questions that people just don't understand the language of? Or are there other methods of being able to receive an application in terms of video, in terms of audio, in terms of really simple 3 questions that really get to the heart of, what is it that you want to do? What difference do you think it will make? And how can we help you achieve that? Right? It can be as simple as that, and being open to not necessarily knowing all the technical detail of, do they know the data, and it doesn't have to be that. In some cases you have to go for more detail, but not always. um, and then there's a whole range of facilitation and conversation around needs. So at that stage, we're always trying to understand the need of those potential innovators coming into the space. And so it might be just a case of, actually, we don't have a peer network here, right? So that peer exchange and that peer network, when you're bringing a group of innovators together, so to say, we all care about this situation, but we didn't know about each other. And now we feel we have some allyship in being able to address this, and we can learn from each other from our own experiences here. So it's a really important part of that. It's not about us capacity building, it's just about us providing a space to bring innovators together. But then there's the other aspects of things like the mentoring and the technical coaching. So there might be business planning, entrepreneurship, thinking about growth and scale, and the different ways you think about how you might develop a solution. There's the technical prototyping. How do you get, minimal viable product? How do you start to think about how you talk about this product and demonstrate it to others? How do you think about the outcomes that are related to that? There is the impact narrative. If you're going to go out to other funders to look for support for your innovation, people want to know what your impact narrative is and how, and some innovators aren't as clear about how do I know what I'm trying to do with this, but how do I talk about how the real level of impact it's likely to have? And then thinking about different ways you do that. So not just leaning into technical impact frameworks and logic frameworks. There's an element of having to understand that that's there, but what is the storytelling aspect? What is the bit that really leans into your passion of why you're doing that? And how can you make that, how can you utilize that passion in a way that also speaks to what a government department what might need technically? So there's a whole range of different capacity building elements. But I think the showcasing elements are also important. The pitching, the being able to have exhibition stands, being able to invite the public in so you have an opportunity to practice that conversation with others and really get direct feedback about whether people understand what you're doing or not. Those spaces are always really important as well.
Thank you so much, Constance, for sharing the fabulous work that you do. I'm just going to, before we introduce our next speaker, read a lovely comment here from Sam Hanarankin in the chat. Love seeing a challenge approach that's so rich in value creation rather than just a competition with a prize. This kind of holistic perspective really builds stakeholder relations and opportunities beyond the actual winners. Thanks, Constance. I think that's
Thank you.
a lovely way to round off your the lovely things that you shared with us. Thank you so much. We'll have some collaborative chat at the end of this session. But before we do, I'd love to introduce our next speaker, Kaj Löfgren. So Kaj is the CEO of Regen Melbourne, an engine for ambitious collaboration in service of Melbourne, powered by an alliance of more than 220 organisations. Regen is the catalyst and host of a portfolio of projects that are moving Melbourne towards a regenerative future. Kaj is also director of the Small Giants Academy Action Labs, where he leads the incubation and development of new initiatives. A civil engineer by training, Kaj also holds a Masters of Economic History from Lund University. Welcome, Kaj. Thank you for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Perry, Ali, Constance. That was wonderful to hear some of your background and reflections. Many connections were made and notes taken. Thanks for having me. It's just also got a bit moody in the office here. Like the light just changed in Melbourne. So hopefully you can still see me, but good evening to everyone in Melbourne at the end of a Thursday. So I thought I'd share just a little bit of the sort of back of house story of Regen Melbourne, not because the inside view is always that interesting, but because it's kind of provided the scaffolding for the kind of social imagination journey that's been so core to our work over the last 5 years. So that's the plan. And then I'll end with a couple of reflections as well. And I'll try and rush through it relatively quickly so we can have conversations about it. But as Perry was describing, we now talk about our work as being an engine for collaboration in service of the city. We're about 5 years old. We started during the lockdowns of 2020 and in the wake of the Black Summer fires, which raged up and down the east coast of Australia at the end of 2019. And so we were kind of born in a period of significant disruption, which I think is actually one of the sort of external factors that can lead to opportunities for this type of imagination work that I think this series is talking about. The context matters. It matters deeply for how deep and wide we can go with our imagination, our collective imagination work. So our context was that one of severe disruption, which sort of opened up possibilities for our work. And so since then, we've kind of built three major aspects of our work. We've got a big collective vision process, which founded the organization, which was just sort of a big collective process that I'll talk about briefly. After we developed that vision, we developed a portfolio of what we describe as earth shots, which are like pathways towards the vision. So it's sort of interconnected. The vision is the big thing we're aiming for. The earth shots provide our pathways. And then the third aspect, which is perhaps less obvious, is the importance for us of having a kind of knowledge engine that brings different types of knowledge to bear on the vision that we have for the city. So that's what we now describe as the systems lab. And the way we bring that together is that we have a kind of constellation view of our work. So the center of this beautiful illustration, we've got a tile that kind of represents the vision for Regen Melbourne. So that's I'll talk to in a minute. But then the pathways to that vision are represented as almost like these gravitational pulls. So we've got the three earth shots, which are highlighted there as the food work in 15-minute cornucopias, the streets work around 300,000 streets, and then the waterways work, which is around the swimmable Birrarung. And these earth shots provide like a gravitational pull, which brings in partners and projects into a kind of tighter orbit, which we facilitate to become more and more collaborative. And that gets us towards that vision that we have at the center of the page. And then that's all underpinned by this systems lab. So you can sort of hold this conceptual model that I'll come back to a couple of times as a way of, I guess, me stepping through how social imagine shows up in a kind of nested way in our ecosystem. But starting with the vision, so we did this big 6-month collective visioning process at the start of 2020. It was all on Zoom, back when Zoom was super fun still. And we were doing it as sort of an expression of like, what is a regenerative Melbourne to people? When do people find it healthy in the city? When do they feel like they're thriving? When do they feel connected to other people? And also conversely, when do they not feel that? And of course, we had 500 people involved in this process, about 50 different organizations, 25 volunteer facilitators, all done on the sort of smell of an oily rag, a small grant from a wonderful foundation here in Melbourne, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. And we did this big process, and by middle of 2021, we released a report that basically articulated this vision. And we still hold this to be really, really central to what we do. We then, so the process we use to create that, which is sort of a second condition, I think, for good social imagination work, is having some sort of scaffold. And the scaffold that we used for this process was donut economics. And some of you will be familiar with that. Some of you might not be. I'm not going to do an overview of that model, except to say that it provided a kind of methodology that we could cling our energy and excitement to. And it put a little bit of structure around this sort of work. And what it also did was it allowed us, after that vision was released, to work on what is the kind of rigor and the data and the kind of quantitative side of that vision. So we produced this beautiful qualitative expression of what a regenerative Melbourne could be. And then we put together lots of university partners, dozens and dozens of collaborators to say, well, how do you express that vision in a way that speaks to the quantitative questions that we have in the city? So the donut model provides us with all of the social foundation elements, things like education, health, arts, food, those sorts of elements that create a thriving life. But of course, that has to be bounded within the ecological ceiling, which is largely made up of the planetary boundaries. And so we said, well, how do you quantify Melbourne's social foundation? How do you quantify our planetary boundaries? And if you go to donut.regen.melbourne, you'll find our emerging answer to that question. And so the point of bringing that into this conversation is to say that central tile, which is an expression of our vision of what a regenerative Melbourne is made up of both the qualitative element, which we talk about as the poetry, and the quantitative element, which we talk about as the grammar. So poetry and grammar kind of expression of what makes up a vision for regenerative Melbourne. So that's that central goal that we're aiming for. But we also realized very early on that just setting up a new vision, even if it was quantifiable, doesn't give people a lot of agency. It doesn't give people and organizations a sense that they can participate. And so we worked with other models and other ways of organizing to come up with what we describe as earth shots. And these are effectively wildly ambitious orientations, which we sort of put together almost like a portfolio now. So we think about what are the layers the infrastructure layers that make up for a healthy and thriving city. And these are three of them. Now, there are, of course, others as well, like energy would be another infrastructure layer of a city, or health might be another infrastructure, or education. But we basically looked at what was coming up through the alliance that Regen Melbourne was founded on, and we said, well, waterways. There's lots of interest in how do we create regenerative waterways. There's lots of interest at street level activation. How do we unlock kind of the power of street level organising to serve to the regeneration of the city? And then food systems. Melbourne sits on a food bowl. That's why we're here. That's why we're in this place. So how do we respect that? That aspect of where we are, that bioregion, and think about how do we create resilient food systems. And so out of that process, we developed these 3 earth shots, which took years. So just to be clear, like neat PowerPoint presentations like this sort of flatten a whole lot of messiness. So let's acknowledge that this is a meandering, circular, messy process. But by using this methodology of mission-oriented innovation or challenge-oriented innovation, which is not dissimilar to what you were describing, Constance, basically names a grand challenge, the swimmable Birrarung, making our main waterway thriving and swimmable again as the grand challenge. We then look at what are all the cross-sector actors that make up that ecosystem, both usual and unusual actors. How do you put them into sort of transition pathways that represent the different aspects of the system that would need to change to actually bring that to bear? And by organising in that new configuration, the theory is, and now more and more the practice, is that we get a new and unique set of collaborative interventions that emerges. And the sum total of those interventions leads to tangible steps towards, in this case, a swimmable Birrarung. And so on the river over the last 3.5 years, our wonderful lead convener, Charity Mosignani, you can see there in the bottom left, after her and I and my colleague Nick swam in the Birrarung not too long ago. Charity has organised a whole bunch of actors into a new formation. We've analysed what is the systemic opportunity and the challenge here. We've thought about what are the measurable goals that we can identify. We've built a collective governance mechanism around the river and all the river actors. And out of that process, we've basically developed a portfolio of interventions that speak to practical ways that we can get towards swimmability. So each of our 3 Earthshot ecosystems has one of those sort of collectives. It's like a sub-ecosystem within Regen Melbourne. But in the interest of time, and just to introduce the sort of other axis of our work, the Systems Lab is incredibly important in saying that we need to have an ability in sort of emergent and complex work to do deep thinking, and to have that deep thinking and practice connected to the action work. So we think about our kind of Earthshots and our Systems Lab. It's almost like the wisdom and the action part of the yin and the yang, and they intersect because a lot of the work of the Systems Lab happens through action research in the Earthshot portfolio. But here we're looking at the long-term conditions that need to change in order for our work to be more successful, and also for the work of a broader field to be more nourished and fertile. So we're looking at the kind of layers that we need to change, starting with stories. So what are the new narratives of place that we need to explore? Measurement. How do we get through the measurement paradigm of our current state and think about how do you measure what actually matters? How do we govern differently? How do you set up new decision-making frameworks that honour collective voice? How do you build capital flows that are in service of regeneration rather than service of single-point solutions and accumulation? And then how do you move knowledge differently through the systems? How do you set up collaborative research practices? So these are like long-term questions. And you can almost think about these as like the long wavelength work, whereas the Earthshots is kind of that short wavelength agitation of a system that is required to kind of throw up new questions and potentially new pathways. So the Systems Lab is basically identifying the problems. It's experimenting with sort of action and research interventions, and it's also translating those learnings up through the system. So what that adds up to, and this is where my recovering engineering brain can be helpful, but also potentially flattens a lot of the messiness. What we end up with is portfolios. So we at Regen Melbourne are a non-profit organisation. We're 10 staff. We're fully philanthropically funded. And also we've got relationships with dozens of practical demonstration projects, which sit within the Swimmable Birrarung, 300,000 Streets, and our food systems work. And those interventions are projects, some of which we're leading, some of which we're collaborating and orchestrating, and some of which we're acting as more of a field-building organisation, telling stories and creating connections. And those interventions kind of map also to those systems layers. So we end up with the kind of portfolio view of all of these activities that are oriented towards the goals that we're seeking and can start to connect some of the dots and some of the patterns and tell a more systemic story of the change that we are seeing and the change that we need to happen. So that's kind of the Regen Melbourne overview, and obviously happy to answer lots and lots of questions on that. But just in the interest of this topic, I just thought I'd break out how I was thinking about this in the context of a conversation around social imagination. And I guess if you think about the story that I just sort of whipped through really quickly, there was a kind of large collective imagination process that set up our vision for place. And that was a really critical foundational element. And we did that before we even knew there would be a Regen Melbourne. So that was very much a kind of collective expression at a particular time, very disruptive time in our city. Then there were collective imagination processes in each of the earth shots. Each one required a kind of leap of imaginative faith that actually you could take a degenerated river system and regenerate it, or you could take a disconnected web of streets and connect them. Or you could take a food system that's been built in a degenerative economy and make it regenerative. That's a huge imaginative leap of faith in this day and age, but that's absolutely what that was doing. And then you've got all the specific interventions, right? The actual portfolios that emerge out of that process. And each one of those is like a micro expression of what could be done if we organize in new ways, which is also, I think, an expression of collective imagination. But they result in different things. And this is where I think it sort of perhaps gets into some of the nuances and some of the discussion, because the vision that we created for place developed a significant amount of alignment between disparate actors. It set up kind of connection and relational fabric between, and it constructed a kind of civic mandate, a permission to act together, which was very different from the action orientation that the imagination work around our earth shots created. It was much more about like, what can we do together? So it became more movement oriented, and also actually put actors together that wouldn't normally play together. So businesses and activists, governments and academics into the same conversation with the same orientation, which although they were in the same room in the place visioning process, they weren't necessarily sitting together going, maybe we could do things. It was much more of that expansive end. So it was a slightly different nuance on this question of collective or social imagination. And then the projects and the work around the projects is like the action and the evidence. This is where we start going, oh, we can back up the process of mass visioning and collective imagination work. And from that evidence, that action of working together, that's where the momentum comes from that sustains this work over time. So there's three very different types of imagination work going on there, and it sort of manifests as different ingredients that are required, I think, to sustain this work. And the last thing I'll say is in January this year, we nominated and appointed a new director of Regen Melbourne. As I said, we're a non-profit organisation. And we appointed a new director, Dominique Hess, who was appointed as a traditional director of the organisation, but also has delegated responsibilities to provide a voice for nature in the governance of our work, which is a big imaginative exercise, and one that is like both beautiful and challenging, because she wouldn't mind me saying that halfway through a board meeting, she'll stop proceedings and she'll say, look, I'm speaking now on behalf of nature, and she'll reflect, and then we'll have a big conversation about it. And then she might pop up at a different time and say, well, I'm just Dominique right now, and this is what I see about the finances, Kai, or this is what I see about that decision that you think you're making. So this kind of theatrical embodiment of an imaginative practice is also starting to filter through the organisation. And so this picture I took on the Birrarung a few weeks ago, when we were there as a team, really asking the question of what is the river asking of us as a collection of actors? And so constantly having this practice of thinking about different voices in the work. Constance, you talk about young people in the end of your reflections. And I think just bringing up opportunities for those diverse stakeholders to play an active role and embracing the playfulness of that, I think, is another thing that we've definitely picked up on across our work. I'll leave it there. Thanks, team.
Thank you so much, Kai. It's always such a pleasure to hear the story of Regen Melbourne, because it can, over the course of 5 years, it can seem like something that's always kind of existed in its current state. And it's amazing to remember that it really did start with workshops and convening different people from across the system saying, how can we bring you together? How can we share knowledge? And we have a question to that point. I think you spoke to this a bit, but it feels like a great opportunity to elaborate a little bit more. When we have a question from Ritu asking, who was involved in developing the vision of Regenerative Melbourne?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we grapple with this question of representation and participation a lot in the work that we do. And it's literally in the name that we are sort of here in service of Greater Melbourne's regeneration. It's written into our constitution that we are an organisation dedicated to the social and environmental regeneration of our city. And yet, of course, we don't represent the humans of the city in any democratic way. Like that's not something that we can claim. Now we can think about how do we get to diverse voices in all the different types of imagination work that we do, and also, the very tangible projects that we work with. But it's quite distinct from the idea of setting up a kind of pseudo-democratic structure in parallel to government. The way I like to think about this is more around like we are in a period of fundamental transition, economic transition in the most holistic sense of the word, social, environmental, economic, ecological. And what sort of infrastructure do we need to manage that transition well? And we think that there is a huge gap in the context of the neoliberal erosion of the role of government over the last 50 years, as well as the kind of lack of trust that people now have as a result in the traditional forms of governance that we are within. And so what is the role of kind of transitionary infrastructure to start to kind of grapple with the questions, build examples, and then allow all the sort of formal modes of governance, including local, state, and federal government in the Australian context, to find their place again. So on the river, for example, the river system has a complex web of governance around it. Melbourne Water plays a big role. State government's Department of Environment plays a big role. The water utilities play huge roles. And the organising that we're doing is involving them. It's certainly open to their involvement. We invite them to everything. We play with them on projects sometimes. But ultimately, the regeneration of the Birrarung has to be led by those actors because they've been democratically put in place to manage the river. Now, if they're not doing as good a job as we think, we need to find new ways to help them and support that. But ultimately, they will step into that role where there is a realization that this work is building momentum and politics and government should step out in front of it. And that we'd welcome that. We would think that was wonderful. And our posture would change as a result. So we're seeking broad representation, we're seeking diversity, we're seeking voices, but we're also really conscious that our role is a transitionary one. We often talk about the earth shots as biodegradable. They will change and morph over time. They're in relationship with the system that we're in. Right now, it feels like that scaffolding needs to be quite firm and quite strong in order to shift the current state conditions. But if you ask me in 5 or 10 years, do they look the same? I'd say almost certainly not, because hopefully the ship system has changed in the direction that we need it to change in.
And what an imaginative understanding of the role of an organization and how it's shaped and how it convenes. I really appreciate the added explanation. We have two comments, not questions, from the audience, and then we'll be hearing from Shamal. Um, Nick Hope says, Kai, I really appreciate how this process has created a blueprint of discovering the possible for others, daring to wonder and imagine. And I think daring to wonder and imagine is a great pre-gen tagline. And Jackie Williamson shares, fabulous, concise summary of such a huge, exciting, and vital endeavor for our beautiful city. Thank you. Ooh, and we have a last minute question from Laura James coming in. How do you hold space for burst urgency and imagination in a time of crisis? That is absolutely beautiful. I might wonder if that's okay that we might put a pin in that one because that feels like something that all three speakers could speak really well to. It's like that Beo Kamlafe quote, like the times are urgent, we must slow down. So like, how do we hold space for urgency and imagination in a time of crisis? To be continued. We're not going to rush to answer that one because we do want to hear from Shamal Das. So Shamal is a board director, and thank you very much, Kai. Shamal is a board director, executive, and educator focused on positive social impact. He serves as chair of the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, colloquially known as ARACI, and NED at Too Good Foundation and Earthwatch Institute Australia, and is on multiple committees. In one of his several executive roles, Shamal leads the philanthropic services and family advisory business at JB Ware, and his team of specialists provide tailored to for-purpose organizations and private clients in areas ranging from governance, management, leadership, structuring, systems change, sustainability, and organizational strategy. All of the good things that we need advice in. Shamal is also an adjunct associate professor at the Center for Social Impact University of New South Wales Business School, where he teaches Governance for Social Impact course for Australian Graduate School of Management. And this is a course that he co-created in 2017. And as he says, most importantly, Shamal is a proud parent to two young humans, Camille and Samuel. So that gives us a little taste of some of the things that we might hear about as we enter into discussion with Shamal. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Ali, and thanks everyone for having me. I guess I could start with the teenagers if you want to talk about imagination. It's quite interesting exercise. Look, I'm going to focus. I think I have no slides. I just want to talk today, I guess, about without trying to repeat what Kai and Constance have covered so eloquently. Is I'm sort of the person they bring in when everyone's had the imaginative love fest, and then someone has to design around it to make sure things start happening and everyone stays focused and the funding stays around. And so both at so at Oracy currently, we're in the second year of what they call the Investment Dialogue for Australia's Children, which is a huge venture across multiple philanthropists and the federal government, multiple departments in the federal government, which is now going to cascade down into place through state and local governments. So you can imagine that is quite a tent that we're dealing with there, focused on children, their families, and their communities. So you can imagine the challenges that come with that. And again, there's the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, which is its precursor contained in Queensland. One thing to pick up from Kai there is something people forget is there is actually this weird systemic drive to make organizations out of things. To self-sustain things in nauseam. The fact is, if you're 5 years into a systems change initiative and you still have the same goals, you're not doing a very good job because nothing's happening. So, and if you're still there in 10 years, maybe it's time to have a think about whether you're pulling up stumps. And so really importantly, there's this weird systemic drive to make things look and feel a certain way and to really drag it into the system. So governance is where I focus my energy because that's the tool where you get to determine, I guess, really important, what are the really boring things, but can actually determine how imaginative you can be in both thinking and execution. And so that's where you get to do really important but boring things like changing risk appetite statements, rewriting policies and structures, deciding who's at the table when decisions get made, deciding which priorities get funding. These are like the boring things no one wants to talk about, but that's actually how things get done. And so that's why governance is where I focus because hearts and minds are important, but resource flows really determine where things happen and who gets to play. And it's and really how power gets distributed. Because how you dial things up and down in governance also is how you create the space where, to Kai's point, using constellation as an example, maybe I will, is perhaps where I'll use that as an example before we get to the conversation, which is the more important part. So to think about the Constellation project, which kicked off in 2018, you actually have to go back 10 years before that. And I think everyone who's been involved in this work understands that we talk about organizations and change and collaborations. Underlying it all is actually just people who want to work together towards the things they want to get done. It's rarely departments and organizations that work together and collaborate. It's the people within them who want to achieve a certain outcome. And so Centre for Social Impact got established in 2008. PwC was one of their founding partners. 10 years on, in 2018, under Christy Muir's CEO leadership, PwC, to mark 10 years, funded a big program of work called Amplify. Housing and homelessness was the key part that they wanted to actually start off as one of the five key thematic areas, like Kay was saying. It's got to start somewhere, and someone goes, let's do a piece of research and see what works in housing, what doesn't, what are the barriers, what are the levers. And then on the back of that, they did this one thing called the Connect and Convene event around launching the report. All the right people were there. But really important starting point was that this didn't start at community housing or homelessness services. It started at PwC, an institution with huge amounts of money and capability and infrastructure. and a university research institute. So they had the power to convene a different group of people together than would usually turn up to a homelessness conference. And so bringing them together, which then allows you access to people like bankers, insurers, others, people like me turn up who are running billions of dollars in wealth. And then we sit there and we had the session, and then at the end of the session said, we've got the report, but we need to actually take the ideas in the report and do something. Impact isn't created by research reports writing about what's happening. And so the four convening asked me to chair. They said, well, let's create a project out of this, and we need an independent chair, and that's when they brought me in. The other partners of it were Mission Australia, obviously housing and homelessness being core to them, and the Australian Red Cross, because of their volunteering and the impact that was happening in certain communities, housing especially, and the climate impacts on housing was an interesting area for them. So for that, so now we have really effectively an entity, not an organization. It doesn't really exist. It's a collaboration. It's just a group of people hanging out here at this stage. But we have access to significant resources through the institutions that have convened it. And never underestimate that who is in that room at the start really matters, because it's their institutional capabilities that you're often leveraging. Rather than creating your own little smell of an oily rag type thing that might, you want to actually bring those people in at some point. So what we did then was, and again, leveraging relationships becomes really important, because then I sort of went to equity trustees who I just know people there from previous roles and said, look, we're going to need a grant here to actually understand one element of this, which is what became apparent is that the missing link in a lot of the design work going on was lived experience. We solve a lot of housing and homelessness issues in Australia without talking to anyone who's been affected by those issues. And so bringing them to the table was actually one of the things we identified as the most important thing we could do uniquely to get different ideas, imagine a different world than what was really, in essence, developers with spreadsheets trying to solve for housing and governments funding those things. That's all we were doing, really. And in certain parts of housing, that's still what we're doing, right? Because it's about numbers, it's about scale, it's about returns. But for other parts of housing, what we needed was lived experience at the table, not just at the organization level, but at the board level, so we could actually have decision-making power. And we got the grant to do that. We did that, and we trained the entire organization on lived experience with that grant, so we could be ready to do the work. We had to get ourselves ready. We didn't. One thing we were smart enough to realize is you don't just decide you want lived experience and then point at someone with homelessness lived experience and say, hey, why don't you join the board? That is not how things work. That is a poor outcome for everyone. And so beyond that, though, what we realized was that we needed to go much deeper. As soon as we pulled on the thread, and this is the emergence of systems change, we realized that was actually nearly the most important thread. It wasn't where we thought our most important work would be, but it became where our most important work was. And then we secured actually a very large multi-year grant on the back of that first grant from equity, which was in excess of $600,000, to do deep lived experience work. And what it became was, in essence, not just about housing. It was about unlocking private capital into housing, but it's ensuring that the right people ended up in the right houses at the right time. And that is when it changed how we thought about housing in the solutions that we were going to lean into, as opposed to all the other parts of housing that other people were trying to address. Homelessness services gave us a very clear idea of where we were going to add value. And then that money got applied to actually youths exiting institutions and what the experience of housing looked for them, because in long-term impact, if you can address housing at that point for that cohort, you have huge outsized impact for their families and communities over the long term. So that's where the research went. And during that, we did the other system stuff, which is like, well, why don't we merge with the Business Alliance so we can get rid of all these multiple alliances all around the same issue and try to consolidate them into a singular more powerful voice with more access and more influence. And so that's where governance starts playing a role, is where are your leverage points and what do you need to do? I think the one thing that we get lost in is that we think about imagination as just sitting, groups of people sitting around imagining these amazing things that have never existed. It's actually putting the right groups of people together, to Constance's point, around the right problem that has the possibility of actually being solved. I'm not interested, because the thing is, if you want to go true imagination, you can sit here and go back to the start of capitalism and think about commodification of people, land, and capital, and go there and start again. But there's a lot of unwinding to do there. So you start here and you go, well, what is the evolution of the thing we know that we want to get our hands around? And then imagine the tools and the barriers that keep it in place, and a different way of doing those things, or adapting those slightly to actually shift the system. Which is why I end up in institutional type work and cross-sector work, because that's where my skill set lies in governance, is moving those and getting people to align on vision and intent on certain things. There are other people that play very different roles in the system, and that's what they're good at. We need all the people doing all the things. But that's where my imagination becomes about, how do you flip governance so it's community-led and driven? How do you keep how do you get philanthropists money but keep them away from the decision-making of how it's spent? How do you get governments to redesign their funding flow so the community might be able to decide which programs they want and which ones they don't, rather than just getting the whole spoon, force-fed? They're the type of things, they're the mechanisms that I sort of spend my time on. I'll just stop there, Ali.
Thank you so much, Shamal.
Thanks so much, Shamal. Look, you bring such an interesting perspective to this issue, and I'd love to ask you a little bit, as someone with your set of skills and perspectives on the value.
I'm like Liam Neeson. Yeah,
like Liam Neeson.
Yeah.
But I mean,
governance is my particular set of skills.
Absolutely. But all these, like you described them, boring elements are absolutely critical. And the knitting together of, structures, processes, funds with the imagination, relationships, heart. And so that feels to me such a critical part of actually getting somewhere in this work. And you bring a really important perspective on that. I want to ask you slightly kind of a question about your own interests in this and the things that really draw you in and excite you.
Yeah.
How do you choose between system-changing imaginative projects? So, what are you looking for when you hear great ideas that are small and fledgling, that have really big ambitions? What are the sorts of things that you are looking for to test, whether that's something you want to lend your expertise towards?
I get drawn to things. So I have an economics background, so you get thinking in big systems. They don't call it systems change or any of that, but it's how you're taught to think. And so in complexity with multiple agents. So if you can think about it, housing and homelessness is, to me, if you're in family violence, if you're in youth, if you're in regional rural Australia, like poverty, it cuts across all cohorts. So I get drawn to things that can actually have a outsized impact if we were to rethink how we're doing things, and things that I think have a there are a lot of worthy causes out there, but I get drawn to the ones where I think are really have a I guess a justice element underneath them, like what I consider to be, a just outcome in an economic system that doesn't really value that at all at the moment. The way we've constructed the current capitalist model, it doesn't. A just outcome is not considered, a market's purpose at all, or an economy's, and governments are struggling with that. And again, you can imagine children and youth is about children, families, communities, because there are massive pockets of disadvantage in this country, which is not because we lack wealth. So it is because we have designed a system that keeps certain communities in certain places. And so we live in a country where big things like that can be addressed. And so they're the things that draw me, is what is it that we're going to learn through this process that can possibly be applied to solve other problems. They're the things I get drawn to, because it's not just these one-off things. I'm not interested in singular things. I'm interested in things that develop. Like my view is, if we do it for 10 years and it stops, that's fine. I have no interest in things lasting for 100 years trying to address one problem. But at the end of 10 years, is what artifacts have been left behind that allow us to do the next thing better? Because we've learned so much in this exercise. And that's the things, they're the things that draw me in.
Thank you so much, Shamal. I feel like I want to ask you another question about governance, but I'm aware of the time, and I feel like we should at least have a question that is cross-cutting, that enables all of you to respond to it. Ali, have you got a question that you'd like to ask all
I
participants to?
I do. Well, I think Laura does. I think Laura's question, and Kai, you responded to it very eloquently in the chat. And Shamal, I feel like you're starting to get to it in terms of like how does the way that we're working kind of shift and leave behind things now? So it's not about quick fixes, but about using imagination to kind of progress our understanding. I might invite you to add on a little bit if you'd like. And Constance, I'm curious because we haven't heard from you on this, but Laura's question around how do you hold space for both urgency and imagination in times of crisis? And to me, this speaks so much to productivity. How do we prove that this is worthwhile? Is it just space for fluffiness? We know that it's not. So but yes, and how do you hold both in your practices, in your minds, in the way that you partner, in the way that you think about governance and milestones? Shamal, I might invite you to speak really briefly since you've been on a bit of a roll, and I feel like this is a continuation.
Urgency, yeah. Look, I think urgency is critical, but I think there's an element of sort of in complexity theory, right? Urgency, emergency drives you to action. And to pick up something I think Constance said earlier is if you don't spend enough time understanding the problem, you're solving the wrong thing. So you just run off and do something. It's like a weird obsession with carbon emissions, right? For so long. That is not the entire problem of biodiversity and all the other elements of it. That's one element that but we've made it into a market, and then we've actually then commandeered it back into a very unimaginative solution because it fits into the thing we're already doing. So I think I spend a lot more time holding space to make sure we understand the problem before. So it's sometimes in governance is holding back action, and getting people to pause is the thing I'm doing most.
Incredible. Thank you. I think there's several quotes that come to mind, but Constance, I'd love to hear your take on that as well.
I'm aligned with that. I think from my perspective, we are always in a state of urgency. We are always in a state of some level of crisis at some point or another. And our instinctive response is to do something about it now. But if we don't take a step back and really reflect on what is this crisis about, or what I think there's some redefining we need to do about what we class as urgent and what we see as a crisis. There are certain crises that are highly visible that we need to do something about in terms of taking action to save lives or to do something there. But I think beyond that, we have constructed this realm of urgency in the way we live our lives. Everything is urgent. That email needs to be responded to now. This thing needs to happen right this minute. And I think actually we should lean into redefining that for ourselves and redefining what we really mean by urgent. And if we take a step back, I often find, much to a lot of people's minds, if I don't respond to that email for 3 days, people recognize at the end when I have a conversation with them that it wasn't that urgent. Whereas in that moment, it felt very urgent and very very present to them. So I just think we need to probably think about that a little differently so that we can have the right space to address the problem, to understand the problem better, as Shamal said. I think we have to be able to just take a breath and recognize what is actually really urgent, and then create potentially systems that can just galvanize people a bit quicker into conversation, as opposed to what we tend to do is not have the conversation. We're just going to find somebody that can figure this out and take action, whereas actually mechanisms that help us galvanize people and bring people together quicker, and processes that help us explore the situation a bit quicker may be more helpful.
Ali, do you mind if I just add one little reflection that goes beyond the sort of note that I left in the chat? Because I think I fully subscribe to the view that both of you are describing, in particular the kind of acknowledging that we live in a context of busyness and action, and so therefore there's a pendulum required to swing the other way. I'd also probably argue that each of us probably has a bias, and organizations have a bias. And so my encouragement, something I think about quite a lot, is, we've built the systems lab, which is kind of a space for that deeper exploration, and we've got the earth shots, which is where we kind of encourage the action. And I sort of feel like some organizations should be encouraged to into imagination and deep reflection, and some probably need to be encouraged into action and action-based learning. And some individuals probably need encouragement into it, and based on where their kind of individual and organizational biases are, because I suspect we need the people who are just acting without a lot of thought to slow the hell down, and we need the people who are doing a lot of the thinking, who aren't necessarily acting, to speed up. And so I kind of feel like it's kind of nuanced in who this sort of wisdom would apply to. And I suspect if we go about our days and we look at our inboxes and we think about the meetings that we've got scheduled over the next week, we can probably apply that little lens to those that need to speed up and those that need to slow
It's
down.
a really, really important point, Kai, because it frustrates me sometimes, because sometimes a window appears for change and people want to have another symposium and gathering and talk about the problem some more.
That's right.
It's like no. We've done the work for 5 years. We know the answer. If the window's open, take the shot.
And that's something that I think about quite a lot. I think there's sort of sometimes a lack of tactics in systems change. There's a lot of conversation, and it's actually in the doing and the learning from the doing. But of course, in order to do that well, you need to have the right kind of culture or framework or coalition around you that it kind of encourages that learning. So it's not about single point solutions and short-term metrics and all that crap that gets in the way of deeper, more systemic work.
Well, this feels quite ironic to bring in, as we're getting into a really rich conversation, that we are at time and we're going to allow the clock to stop us.
Slow down, Ali, slow down.
The sort of coalition to encourage that learning. And before everybody in our lovely audience heads off for the rest of your evening, I would like to invite you to continue the conversation and to join us in whatever sort of emerging coalition is coming together around these ideas. So you'll have in the chat, the first one is a link to our next session, which will be session 3, around whose imaginations are we living in? So getting a little bit more to the sort of power and politics and positionality. Shamal's nodding. We're like, we started getting there a bit more today, so we'll have a bit more time to open that up.
I'll come back.
Yeah. We'll look for your questions in the
audience
section.
member.
Yeah. And thank you so much to everybody out there for your very generous comments and questions, and for being the other half of our webinar. Without you guys, it would just be a bunch of us on a Zoom chat, which sounds delightful, but maybe a little bit less impactful in field building. So thank you so much for the audience. A huge round of applause, of virtual applause, and thanks, and whatever that looks like for you, where you are, for our speakers. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks all. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
I never want to end it because I love all the things coming in on the chat, and I still see that there's people online, and I don't want to end it before they've left. It's like I don't want to kick them out of the party.
Oh, that was just